Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight,
Congress may be prepared to move forward with impeachment.
Fallout from the breach of the Capitol building. Members of the Illinois congressional delegation weigh in on whether to impeach President Donald Trump.
When pressed to move and denounce the violence, he barely did so.
Plus, the legal and political machinations behind growing calls to remove the president from office via the 25th Amendment.
We also saw a clear failure to carry out equal justice.
After storming of the Capitol, some point to starkly different law enforcement responses compared to seen at the Black Lives Matter demonstration. Why Capitol law enforcement appeared to be so unprepared.
It was hard enough before the pandemic.
Staving off foreclosures and supporting seniors, Chicago Tonight in your neighborhood is back in Belmont-Cragin.
This is the best way to start the new year.
We hear from the doctor who was the first person in Chicago to be vaccinated against COVID-19. She got her second dose this week.
We understand people have opinions, but at the same time, we're going to do what we know.
But is what they know enough to beat the Saints? James Big Cat Williams gives us his take on the Bears wild card playoff matchup.
And a portrait of a retired Chicago public school teacher who now dedicates himself to the art of printmaking in the Mexican tradition. But first, some of today's top stories. President Donald Trump facing calls of impeachment and removal from office by the 25th Amendment this evening issued a videotaped message condemning the violence yesterday and calling for a, quote, smooth, orderly transition of power on January 20th.
This moment calls for healing and reconciliation. 2020 has been a challenging time for our people.
We'll have much more on the fallout from yesterday throughout the broadcast, including local Congress members weighing in on those calls for impeachment. A Chicago area man has been arrested in connection with yesterday's riots at the U.S. Capitol. Capitol Police say Bradley Ruxdales of North Suburban Inverness was arrested for unlawful entry at the Capitol building. That's according to a release by the U.S. Capitol Police, although it appeared to perhaps misspell his name. At least one other suburban Chicago man was reportedly arrested. Dozens of others have been arrested, including outside the Capitol, on those and other charges, including assaulting a police officer and carrying an unregistered firearm. State public health officials report more than 8,700 new cases of the coronavirus in the last 24 hours, including 177 additional deaths. A grim milestone for Illinois, now passing more than 1 million cases reported. There's been a total of 17,272 deaths. The preliminary 7-day test positivity rate is 9.8%. A former Chicago alderman is going to jail, although not for reasons of political corruption. A Cook County judge has ordered former First Ward Alderman Joe Moreno to be held without bail, calling him a, quote, danger to the community. This after he allegedly drove drunk last month and damaged more than half a dozen vehicles. Moreno is awaiting trial on felony charges of obstruction of justice and insurance fraud, stemming from a separate case that began nearly 2 years ago. And now to Paris and reaction to yesterday's protests and riots from local members of Congress. Paris.
Brandis, a year ago this month, the impeachment of President Donald Trump was taking place, and now, 12 months later and after yesterday's rioting on Capitol Hill, the idea of impeaching the president is once again gaining support. And joining us to discuss the possibility of impeachment and more is Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia, a Democrat representing Illinois' 4th District, Congressman Brad Schneider, a Democrat representing Illinois' 10th District, and Congresswoman Robin Kelly, a Democrat representing Illinois' 2nd District. Thank you all for being here. We're very grateful that you're safe, you're healthy. First, Congresswoman Kelly, you were trapped in the House chamber as rioters stormed in. Tell us what happened next.
Well, it was very, very scary. We were all sitting on one side of the chamber, and we saw everyone else leave the floor. Representative Schneider was with me also, and they asked us to come around to the Democratic side. So we were going under the rails and across the steps, and then they were barricading the door and the guns came out. So we all kneeled. Brad was laying straight out and really looking out for each other, but it was very, very scary. As a gun violence prevention person, you know, I just thought like, wow, is this the way it's gonna be? You know, I didn't wanna say, am I gonna go out this way? But it was very scary.
So you mentioned Congressman Schneider was laid out. Congressman Schneider, what was going through your mind while this was taking place?
Well, I took comfort knowing that we had the Capitol Police in the chamber, but it was, my first thought was, of course, for my family, my wife, my kids, my parents. The circumstances for the people I was with, as Congresswoman Kelly mentioned, we were looking out for each other, and really for our country, seeing what was happening in the People's House, an assault by American citizens, bull rushing the barricades and really trying to undermine our Constitution. The end of the story is the blessing. They didn't succeed. We regathered ourselves. Congress came back last night and we finished the work we had started at 1 o'clock yesterday. Congressman Garcia, as Schneider mentioned, you had to finish your work. Now it's a day later. Have you had time to process everything that's happened?
Still processing. There's much to unpack here, but I think it's important that from this dark moment, we get to the bottom of what forces enabled and encouraged the domestic terrorist attack to occur. Obviously, the president bears much of the responsibility, but most immediately, we need to do everything necessary to prevent further harm and insurrection that the president can cause in the next 13 days.
And Congresswoman Kelly, to that effect, there are bipartisan talks of another impeachment vote. Do you think an impeachment and removal would actually get anywhere with 2/3 of senators getting on board?
I think that we have to try something. I would first look at, implementing the 25th amendment, but I want to do something, and I don't know if it'll work out, but I want to take some action, whether it's invoking the amendment or the impeachment. And I know people say it's only 13 days, but he can do a lot of damage in 13 days.
And speaking of invoking the 25th Amendment, here's what House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had to say about that today.
I join the Senate Democratic leader in calling on the Vice President to remove this president by immediately invoking the 25th Amendment. If the Vice President and the Cabinet do not act, the Congress may be prepared to move forward with impeachment. That is the overwhelming sentiment of my caucus.
Congressman Schneider, reports are that there have been talks, cabinet-level talks, of invoking the 25th Amendment to remove President Trump. Do you think those would actually come to fruition? There is another report saying Vice President Pence is not keen to do that.
I saw the reports today that the Vice President said he was not keen to do that, as you say. But look, yes, there's only now, I guess, 12 days left. But what takes a lifetime to build can be destroyed in a day. 244 years of American history was under attack yesterday, and this president can do a lot of damage in a short period of time. The Cuban Missile Crisis was only 13 days. So this is something we have to take very seriously. I agree that the Vice President should invoke the 25th Amendment. This president is a threat to the American people and our nation.
Congresswoman Kelly, there's so much news happening. Reportedly, the Capitol Police Chief is resigning, Sergeant-at-Arms resigning, a Capitol Police officer dead. Do you have any more information as to how this was able to happen so easily, this kind of breach?
I don't know how it was able to happen, but it appears that, well, hopefully when there's an evaluation done, that we'll figure out how this was able to happen. But whatever the strategy was, it did not work. And it appears that there were not enough resources. They needed many, many, many more police officers. And I heard on the news that they thought it was going to be 20,000 people, and it turned out to be 40,000 people. And then, of course, the mayor of D.C. didn't get the support that she thought she was going to be able to get from the feds, and had to rely on Virginia and Maryland and even as far down as New Jersey. But clearly, something went wrong somewhere, because it appeared to me, I know a lot of them did their jobs, and I appreciate the protection they give us every day that we're there, but it seemed a little chaotic to me.
Congressman Schneider, what about the fact that there are reports that the early calls for the National Guard to back up some of the police were rebuffed? It was known that this was possible. This was all over chat rooms and right-wing websites. It can't be that they didn't prepare for the possibility of this, can it?
Yeah, No, and I see three breakdowns here. First, this was predictable, it was preventable, and it should have been manageable. Predictable, as Robin touched on, the president had been calling for action. The social media, Proud Boys and other white supremacist, racist groups had been extremely active. This was clearly a moment that was going to be fraught and tense. Preventable is if you, and we've seen it in other actions, this city knows how to respond to large protests. There should have been people out in force. There should have been barricades at various stages, far from the Capitol, intermediate distance and close in. And there should have been contingency plans if there were breaches. And it appeared that in all cases, that didn't happen in here. So we need an investigation. We need a detailed investigation to understand what happened and take steps to make sure nothing like it ever happens again.
All right, once again, we're happy that you were all safe. You were able to complete your business. And our thanks to Representatives Jesus Chuy Garcia, Brad Schneider, and Robin Kelly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the best.
And now to Phil Ponce with more on the 25th Amendment. Phil.
Paris, as you've discussed, calls are rising to remove President Donald Trump from office after he incited a mob at the U.S. Capitol yesterday. Those calls are coming from prominent Democratic politicians and even some Republicans. Today, Illinois Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger called on Vice President Mike Pence and members of the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment against Trump.
All indications are that the president has become unmoored, not just from his duty, nor even his oath, but from reality itself. It is for this reason that I call for the Vice President and members of the Cabinet to ensure the next few weeks are safe for the American people and that we have a sane captain of the ship.
This comes even as Trump's term is set to expire, is set to expire in less than 2 weeks. Joining us now with more on how this all could play out legally are Heidi Kitt-Rosser, a visiting professor of constitutional law at Northwestern Law School, and Aziz Huq, professor of law at the University of Chicago. And welcome both of you back to Chicago tonight. Professor Huq, there's been talk of the 25th Amendment now for 48 hours or so. Remind us exactly, give us just some bullet points on how it works.
So the 25th Amendment was enacted into law in the wake of the Kennedy assassination. It has a number of provisions. The one that's relevant here allows the vice president to call for a vote of the cabinet, made up of 16 people, on whether the president should be removed for office because he or she is unable to discharge his duties.
So, as we've mentioned and has been widely believed, many accuse the president of causing yesterday's assault on the Capitol based on what he said earlier in the day. And let's take a listen to part of what he said.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about.
Heidi Kitt-Rosser, does that statement and other statements that he made before the marchers or the terrorists, I think it's fair to say, went to the Capitol, does that in itself establish what one might consider a prima facie case that would trigger the 25th Amendment?
I think there's a very good argument for that. In triggering the 25th Amendment, it's not a terribly sort of legalistic criterion in the sense that, you don't need to actually show that the elements of a crime could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt or what have you. You have to show, as Professor Huq said, that the president is unable to discharge the duties and powers of his office. And I certainly think both that there is a good case to be made that the president did, in fact, incite the violence that occurred, but beyond that, that speech, as well as his continued statements during the day, as well as what he refused to say after it was apparent that violence was breaking out, make a very good case that he is unable to discharge the duties and powers of his office.
Aziz Huq, less than 2 weeks in the president's term, is the 25th Amendment a realistic option at this point?
I think that it's exceedingly unlikely that we will see a removal via the 25th Amendment, mostly because the amendment clearly reposes the decision about whether to remove a president for incapacity with his vice president. So this is a constitutional provision that is meant to prevent or meant to disallow partisan decisions on removal. It's meant to be done by a co-partisan. And under the provision, it really is in the discretion of the vice president and the cabinet whether to make the removal effectual. At least given what we know so far, the chances that the cabinet will take that step seem very low.
Heidi Kitt-Rosser, we know now that Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer tried to reach out to Vice President Pence, and he would not take their call. Given that, the unlikelihood that the apparent unlikelihood that the Vice President would lend his name to this effort, how about impeachment? How likely is that?
Yeah, I think that I think it is certainly quite plausible that we could see the House initiate proceedings. I think it's actually entirely plausible that we could see the House, given its composition as well as the developments of the last couple of days, have another impeachment vote, echoing the one from last January against the president, whether you could actually get a conviction, a removal, and a disallowance of future office holding in the Senate, given its composition, given the requirement of a 2/3 vote. That I think is unlikely. I could see proceedings and a vote in the House, though.
Aziz Hook, the president, as we reported, released a video about an hour ago in which he condemned the violence at the Capitol and conceded to Joe Biden as the president-elect. Is there an argument to be made that either the 25th Amendment or impeachment could actually make a bad situation even worse and even make him a martyr to his followers?
I think there's certainly the possibility of negative political fallout. I think one positive thing to come from yesterday's events is the very, very public denunciations of the president's authoritarian and populist style that have come not just from the opposing party, but from co-partisans, including the Senate Majority Leader. I think that an effort to remove the president now, particularly through impeachment, because it wouldn't be instantaneous, doesn't just risk undermining that fragile political consensus. It also risks provoking the president into some further precipitous action that may endanger other lives or endanger parts of our democratic institutions.
Heidi Kitt-Rosser, is there a possibility that if no action is taken, neither the 25th Amendment or impeachment, that this could somehow normalize what President Trump has done and then therefore have an impact on the behavior of future presidents?
There absolutely is that worry, and that's actually my biggest worry. I do agree that, on the other hand, there is some risk of backlash, of martyrdom if proceedings do go forward. But I do think the bigger risk is normalization. And assuming that, let's say nothing happened, you didn't even have impeachment proceedings initiated, or they didn't go anywhere, and you don't have the 25th Amendment invoked, and I think it's unlikely that it would be invoked, then I think, the next step is simply individuals who are concerned, certainly political actors who are concerned at present, as well as the next administration, continuing to sort of speak about what was wrong, what was unacceptable, what was authoritarian about what happened, to prevent it from becoming normalized in the judgment of history.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. Our thanks to Aziz Hook and Heidi Kitt-Rosser. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we throw it back to you.
Phil, thank you. On the day that Illinois reached the unfortunate milestone of surpassing 1 million cases of the coronavirus, we visit one of the Chicago communities bearing the brunt of this pandemic. When we last visited Belmont-Cragin in May, it was an epicenter with nearly 2,000 cases in its major zip code. State data shows that now the 60639 zip code is close to 12,000 cases. Amanda Vinicky is in Belmont-Cragin as part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series. Amanda.
Brandis, it goes without saying that nobody wants COVID, but what's also bad is getting it and having no way of knowing. And that was a problem here early on. People said there wasn't enough nearby testing. Not anymore, says local Alderman Gilbert Villegas, who I spoke with outside of Prosser Career Academy. Villegas says that he had fought to get trades training programs at the academy, including one that was going to train adults. Instead, that is on hold because of the pandemic. And Prosser Career Academy is instead one of the several places in the area where people can get tested for COVID-19.
Anybody that talks about testing, I'm trying to bring them to the world here because we want to get as many people as possible tested. You know, the Alderman's office, we're constantly doing city services, but during this pandemic, we've had to pivot. Now we're doing a lot of social service things. We're trying to help people with unemployment, trying to help people with food, masks.
Why are COVID cases higher here? He says it is because the area has a lot of residents who are essential workers and also intergenerational housing in this heavily Latino community.
Belmont-Cragin has the highest number of Latinos in the city of Chicago, in any community. Because when you think about Latinos, you think of Little Village, you think of Pilsen, but actually it's Belmont-Cragin. Belmont-Cragin is made of hardworking men and women, essential workers that take pride in being a homeowner, middle class.
But the pandemic has made things tough, says Ulysses Alanis, who describes his restaurant as a taste of Mexico City in Chicago. It's known for its fresh, handmade huaraches.
It's like they call it huaraches, like a form of a sol, and then you know it's made of a fresh corn dough, and then you put beans inside. You press it on a press, and then you put it on the grill.
He's been in this neighborhood some 30 years, but lately has had to cut back on the hours the restaurant is open. And while, of course, he's glad whenever people order, including online, he says he wishes instead they would call or stop by the restaurant directly because third-party food delivery apps eat up upwards of 25%. And that's money, he says, that could help during this slow time. Still, he wants people to be safe.
A lot of Hispanics has been infected, and we have to be mindful. We have to be smart. You cannot just go out there and go on a party, 20, 30, 50, 100 people. You know, you have to be smart. You have to stay home.
As director of older adult programs at the Northwest Side Housing Center, Linda Peters knows some of the people who've had, and sadly some of the individuals who have succumbed to COVID-19. Peters says most of Belmont-Cragin's 80,000 residents are Latino, nearly 30% are elderly, many are low income, and she says the pandemic has been devastating for those seniors.
Mentally, physically, financially, because a lot of times their families were supporting them and now their families are unemployed, right? Have food insecurity, so that trickles up to the grandparents who now are facing hunger like never before.
She says thankfully programs like those that she is involved with are providing food and meals to seniors, and also a little bit of fun. In every lunchbox is either a newsletter or a crossword puzzle. Also over the holidays they hosted an ugly sweater contest. They're going to have something fun for Valentine's Day coming up. And then there is also a trained bilingual outreach team that reaches out to 400 older adults every single week.
They're calling, they're connecting them with resources, they're hearing about their families. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of deaths in the previous months and current months because of the pandemic. So that lifeline that these callers are making with these older adults really is life-changing.
Another area organization is helping people to stay in their homes through bilingual counseling, as well as through monetary relief to help people who are behind on their rent or their mortgage. The Spanish Coalition for Housing is also aggressively educating both tenants and landlords about the eviction moratorium. That, by the way, is just temporary. So eventually, any overdue rent money does have to be paid back.
oftentimes here in communities like Belmont-Cragin and Hermosa, is that it's a small landlord, 2 to 4 unit property owner who relies heavily on those rent payments to make their mortgage payments. So it's a trickle-down effect when folks aren't able to pay rent and small landlords are relying on rental income. They're then at risk of losing their property from foreclosure.
He is hoping for an extension on the eviction moratorium, but also, and just as importantly, he says city, state, and the federal government need to come through with more relief. And with that, Brandis, back to you.
Amanda, thank you. Up next, a preview of this Sunday's playoff matchup between the Bears and the Saints. Stick around.
Latinos, who make up 1/3 of the population, continue to power the city that works.
These are the people that are working 3 jobs, knowing that COVID is out there. Those are the people that need the help, and we should help them.
Despite a 35-16 loss to the Packers this past Sunday, the Bears are in the playoffs thanks to an Arizona Cardinals loss. They'll face the New Orleans Saints in a wild card matchup this weekend, a team they lost to in overtime earlier this season. Joining us with his take is former Chicago Bears offensive lineman James Big Cat Williams. Big Cat, Happy New Year. Great to see you. First off, we saw a reaction from players around the NFL to what happened yesterday, the riots on Capitol Hill, including Bears receiver Allen Robinson calling the rioters terrorists, Matt Forte talking about how they would likely have been treated differently if they were black. I'm curious, with preparing for a playoff game, how difficult is it to go about your regular business where you have something this dramatic happening in the country?
Well, I think it's one of those situations where, you're aware of what's going on outside the facility. It's such a big story. It is such a, black eye to the United States, to the government. And, it's something that is going to affect your everyday life. But as an athlete, you kind of have to block it out a little bit. Not really block it out, but you have to get past it because you know that you're dealing with your livelihood here as far as football goes, and the preparations that they have to make during the week. It's all very, very important, and you have to be focused on it. You're in the playoffs now. This is one and done. So it is going to affect them a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be something that they bring into the facilities, whether it's, the Bears or the Saints or the Steelers or any other team.
Certainly it's a lot to process, and this is an important game. Big Cat, a tough loss to the Packers this past Sunday. Is there anything you took away from that game that would give you hope that they can beat the Saints?
Well, yeah. I mean, you look at the game and you look at the first drive of the game, and you talk about an offense that has sputtered the majority of the season. It started to look a little better the last couple of weeks, but that drive is what you want, what you expect out of that Bears offense. So for them to put a 14-play drive together, eat up 60 yards, eat up almost 7.5 minutes of clock. I mean, that's what they're going to need against the Saints. And it's not going to be just offensively. They're going to need offense, defense, and special teams in order to win this game.
And they were in the game until late. You see this interception thrown by Trubisky. He's had some good games in the last few weeks. Last week wasn't such a good game. What's the biggest difference between him when he's playing well versus the way he played last week?
Well, I think when he's playing well, you're seeing them put in motion the things that he does well. Running the ball definitely helps. When you have David Montgomery running for yards, the offensive line's able to block for him. They're able to use that play action that we always talk about, the bootlegs, cutting off half the field so he doesn't have to read the whole thing. It's when he drops back in the pocket and they're asking him to read the whole field, diagnose a blitz, and all that together is just proved to be too much for him.
Yeah, certainly still struggling with that stuff. The last time the Bears played the Saints. They came close, 26-23. They lost in overtime. Well, what do we have to think about when looking at the challenges going up against the Saints?
Well, you look at the first game, and it was a good game. It went down to what, almost two minutes left in the overtime before the Saints were able to seal the game. So they played a pretty good game defensively, and that's what they have to get back to. The Saints are get the ball out of their hand quick throws to the backs, to the receivers, and let those players make plays. When you have an Alvin Kamara, you throw a little swing pass to him, and if the Bears don't tackle, that swing pass that could have gone for 2 or 3 yards now goes for 15, 20.
Alvin Kamara reportedly, though, might miss the game. He's got an injury. I don't know that they've ruled him out or ruled him in quite yet. The defense has been struggling a little bit the last few weeks. What do they need to do to get back to the way that, well, they were a year or 2 years ago? Can they do that?
I don't know if they can get back to that point. You're late in the season now, so you're dealing with not only on the Bears, but every team that is still in the playoff hunt is dealing with guys that are hurt, injured, playing with something going on. So, every team is having to deal with this. But you look at the Bears team, and they're a little more banged up, and that's what worries me about Sunday's game, with players like Roquan Smith being out and the importance of what he's able to do on the field. You can't just hand that over to somebody else and ask them to step in.
Linebacker Roquan Smith, a key part of that defense, and as you mentioned, was injured last week. All right, so your bold, realistic prediction. What do you think is going to happen this weekend?
My bold, realistic prediction. The Bears have a chance, but I don't know if they can stop what the Saints are going to bring. If Thomas is healthy and is able to play, even if he's not fully healthy, if he's healthy enough to play, if Kamara plays, they said he practiced today. So those are going to be big things that the Bears are going to have to, they're going to have to watch. The Saints are a team that, they can move the ball up and down the field, but you got to stop them from getting in the end zone. And, we'll just see how a depleted, injury-prone team can do against them this weekend.
All right, well, after a very emotional and sad week in the nation, it'll be good to watch the Bears in playoff football for the first time in a couple of years. All right, Big Cat, thank you so much.
Thanks, Bears. Have a good one.
All right, you too. And the Bears are set to take on New Orleans this Sunday at 3:40, but win or lose, we'll have James Big Cat Williams back next week to recap the season or talk about the Bears' next playoff game. Let's hope it's the latter. And still come on Chicago tonight. The ER doctor who was the first person in Chicago to be vaccinated against COVID-19 tells us about her experience. After yesterday's storming of the Capitol, President-elect Joe Biden and others point to starkly different law enforcement responses seen at Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Why Capitol law enforcement appeared to be so unprepared. And the Mexican tradition of printmaking is alive and well at a Chicago printing press run by a retired public school teacher. But first, some more of today's top stories. Chicago area native Merrick Garland was formally introduced as President-elect Biden's pick for Attorney General today. Garland is from North Suburban Skokie and is a graduate of Niles West High School. He was nominated by former President Obama to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, but was never given a Senate hearing by Majority Leader Mitch McConnell back then. Garland today spoke about the gravity of yesterday's attack on the Capitol and says his goal is to restore the independence of the Justice Department.
Entering the Department of Justice will be a kind of homecoming for me. My very first job after serving as a judicial law clerk was to work as a special assistant to then Attorney General Ben Civiletti.
Healthcare workers at Cook County Stroger Hospital began getting fully vaccinated against COVID-19 today. County Board President Tony Preckwinkle was on hand as the hospital staff members got their second dose of the COVID vaccine. Participants say they were excited to become fully immunized and focused on the importance of vaccinations for members of the African American and Hispanic Latino communities.
Both of those communities that are, a lot of them are essential workers and have no other way of quarantine or distancing themselves all the time, and access is very important to them. So the vaccine, please, please, please go out and get the vaccine.
That was an emergency room physician we were hearing from there who got her second dose of the vaccine. And now we go back to Brandis and one of the first local doctors to get both doses of that COVID vaccine. Brandis.
That's right, Paris. Dr. Marina Del Rios, an emergency room doctor at the University of Illinois Hospital, was the very first person in Chicago to get vaccinated against COVID-19. And then on Tuesday, she got her second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. Dr. Marina Del Rios joins us now to talk about her experience with the vaccine and of being an ER doctor amid this pandemic. Dr. Del Rios, thank you for joining us on Chicago Tonight. First, if you would, tell me a bit about your experience, over these last 10 months or so of being an emergency room doctor really on the very front line of this pandemic. What's that been like?
It's been the most stressful year that I've had in my career. It's very different when you're dealing with heart attacks and traumas, and you know that while it's very sad to see patients in those situations, you yourself may not be at risk, but that added risk of constantly feeling like taking care of patients is also a threat to my own well-being, to my coworkers, and also to any family members that might be taking care of these folks too. That's an added layer of stress that is very hard to deal with.
We've seen cases surging across the country since Thanksgiving. How would you describe the situation at your hospital right now? Are you noticing an increase in cases as well?
We saw a surge not immediately after, but a couple weeks after Thanksgiving. And then the numbers started to drop a bit. We're starting to see a little bit of a climb, and I'm expecting that we'll probably see another peak in another week or two, which would be 2 weeks post the most recent holidays.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so Illinois Department of Public Health Director Dr. Ngozi Ezike on Wednesday, she again talked about the disproportional impact of the virus on Black and brown communities and the need to make vaccines available to them. Here's a little bit of what she said about the state's vaccine outreach.
Our outreach extends to all populations in Illinois, Black populations, white, Latinx, Asian, immigrants, all groups, including individuals that are undocumented. And undocumented individuals will not be turned away when they present for vaccination.
And Dr. Del Rios, you and I know that Black and Latinx communities historically have been skeptical and even mistrustful of medical officials, but you volunteered to be vaccinated early, and in fact, you were the very first person in the city of Chicago to receive the vaccine. As a Latina doctor, how important was it for you to get this vaccine to show so that other members of the Latinx and Black communities could see you?
Look, I think that people model the behavior that they observe. And so if I'm going to ask my patients to get vaccinated, I think it's very important that they see that I myself am okay with getting vaccinated, that I feel safe, and that I feel that this is an effective vaccine. So I think that one of the biggest ways of convincing people to adopt a behavior is by adopting it yourself. And so that's why I've decided that I'm not only happy to be one of the first recipients, but I will also be a vocal advocate for our communities.
And what do you say to those folks who have concerns and mistrust for the medical community?
I think that it's really important that we don't judge people's mistrust, and that we listen, and that we ask questions and give them opportunity to ask as many questions as they need to come up with the best decision for themselves. I think that there's a lot of misinformation out there that medical providers and trusted sources have to address and make sure that the narrative that's out there is changed. And with vaccines, I think there's been a lot of, mixed messaging regarding how quickly the vaccine would be developed, for example, and also what kind of side effects people might have after the vaccine. And so it's really our responsibility to ensure that the correct information is going to people. And so you know, I've told people, given them my social media accounts. I've told my own family members, you know, feel free to share my posts, because again, I think the only way to convince other people is to give them the opportunity to ask questions and to have the information at hand so that they can make the decision themselves.
Have you experienced any side effects? You've received both shots now.
Yeah, well, the first shot was pretty uneventful. I had a little bit of soreness on my arm the day after, and then that was gone. This time, the soreness was there, but yesterday evening, which was about 24 hours post my shot, or maybe closer to 30 hours, I started feeling a little achy, sort of like when you are starting to get the flu, but nothing that I couldn't manage with a dose of ibuprofen and a good night's rest. And by today, I feel back to normal.
Now, we've heard and we've read stories of some of your colleagues, though, who are resistant to getting the vaccine. Obviously, it sounds like you didn't have any reservations, but as a professional in the industry, what kind of reservations might someone have?
Well, even within the medical community, there are a lot of questions that have come up regarding how quickly this vaccine was developed. And so I think it's understandable. The initial message was, oh, we won't have an efficacious vaccine for another year, year and a half. And here we are, you know, 6 months after some of these studies, or 9 months after the studies were started. Now we have what seems like looks like an effective vaccine and that it's safe. So I've been trying to battle those conversations on a one-on-one basis in my department. And I'm glad to report to see and say that some people I've been able to convince, and even one of our custodial workers approached me and said, you know what, I heard you on TV. I'm so proud of you. And I signed up to get my shot. And with others, I've just told them, you know, just ask me questions, ask other people in our department in our institution who've gotten the shot, and ask them how they feel and what they think. And I don't know that we'll convince 100% of people, but hopefully a good enough proportion of people that our whole population will be protected.
Dr. Marina Del Rios, thanks for the work that you do, and thank you for joining us on Chicago Tonight.
My pleasure.
After protesters, rioters, and looters stormed the Capitol yesterday, many were left wondering why Capitol law enforcement appeared so unprepared. And some are pointing to starkly different law enforcement responses seen at Black Lives Matter demonstrations, saying the insurrection reveals a double standard. And this evening, we learned that the U.S. Capitol Police Chief is resigning. Joining us to discuss all that and more are Reuben Jonathan Miller, Associate Professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration and author of the forthcoming book, Halfway Home: Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration, which will be available on February 2nd. And Matt Doherty, Senior Vice President of Threat and Violence Risk Management at Hilliard Hines in Chicago. It's a security risk management firm, which is a Jensen Hughes company. He's also a retired U.S. Secret Service special agent who was in charge of the National Threat Assessment Center. Gentlemen, welcome back to Chicago Tonight. Matt Doherty, let's start with you, please. Given your role in the Secret Service, what was your reaction to the storming of the Capitol yesterday?
And prior to that, I was a U.S. Capitol policeman as a young kid out of college. Appalling. I have never seen anything like it. Obviously, whatever contingency plans were in place, to include the mayor calling for the National Guard, and got them 2 days prior, it was just appalling that the entire perimeter security completely broke down. There must have been a contingency plan, and whatever contingency plan was in place utterly failed. So that was my first impression.
Today, President-elect Biden spoke about yesterday's events. Here's a clip of that.
No one can tell me that if had been a group of Black Lives Matter protesting yesterday, they wouldn't have been treated very, very differently than the mob of thugs that stormed the Capitol.
Reuben Jonathan Miller, we spoke with you, of course, in June amid the civil unrest after the killing of George Floyd. What differences do you see between the law enforcement response and preparation that we saw over the summer compared to what we saw yesterday?
Well, it's not only what we saw on the news, but what's been empirically verified. Police respond very differently to anti-policing protests than they do to other kinds of protests. And we know that police respond very differently to Black Lives Matter protests than they have to right-wing protests. So for example, there was something like, perhaps, I think the latest number is something around 68 altogether arrests that happened in and around what we're calling an insurrection. Something like 68 total arrests. And we know that there were over 300 at the last Black Lives Matter protests just a few months ago in DC. And this mirrors in stark ways the 5-to-1 racial disparity that we know exists in incarceration rates in the United States. And so the differences: police meet Black protesters with greater force. Police meet Black protesters with a different kind of sense of vitriol. And the coverage of Black protests look very different. We call them riots and looting, and things were stolen out of the Capitol, windows were broken, but we haven't used that kind of language with the same speed in relation to these protesters.
Matt, what is your reaction to the different levels of response, the different levels of forces that were deployed yesterday versus any Black Lives Matter protest?
I think Ruben brings up some great points. The Secret Service has always prided themselves on being apolitical. I put my life on the line for a year in the 80s protecting Reverend Jackson as he ran for president. I think there's some very good points there. My theme is what's supposed to happen. What is supposed to happen was an intelligence analysis of demonstrations. Obviously, Black Lives Matter predominantly has a peaceful mission of reforming police departments. The Trump rally had a lot of vitriol, a lot of escalation, but predominantly those were law-abiding citizens too. What happens is when you don't have a good analysis of what I'll call infiltrators in demonstrations, they totally disrupt the peaceful mission and the constitutional right. And certainly Black Lives Matter, just like a Trump rally, has a right for a peaceful assembly as guaranteed in the Constitution. I think there was just a lack, a severe failure, a lack of intelligence gathering to let people know that there were people with violent tendencies in that Trump rally and marching up to the Capitol. Certainly the rhetoric didn't help any, but some valid points by Ruben here.
Former First Lady Michelle Obama released a statement today about her thoughts on yesterday's events, also comparing it to Black Lives Matter protests, which were overwhelmingly peaceful. She said in part, quote, "And yet in city after city, day after day, we saw peaceful protesters met with brute force. We saw cracked skulls, mass arrests, law enforcement pepper spraying its way through a peaceful demonstration for a presidential photo op." Ruben, how was the treatment by law enforcement different yesterday?
I think we saw a kind of leniency from the shots that were captured on behalf of Capitol Police, and as we discussed a second ago, the sheer number. And so, if we think about empirically what has happened, how many people have been arrested, how many people have charges been brought against, we see stark differences between these groups.
Matt, obviously it was horrible yesterday. It could have been worse, but do terrorists, no matter what, do they look at this and do they see vulnerabilities? What do you think?
No doubt about it. And just from a security perspective, that the White House is not a public house. You have to get tours, but they have to be by appointment. They run your name, and our legislator, it's a public house, so it's a public facility. I think that predominantly for the Capitol, they're going to insist that it stay open. But again, it was just appalling how the outer perimeter, inner perimeter, it's not lost on me that you didn't see the National Guard really deployed until there was a response. And I think definitely I can agree with Ruben on, I would have wanted to see a lot more arrests on the outer perimeter for that clearly unlawful activity. And now, by media reports, there's 4 deaths. Clearly uncalled for, lack of a security plan. And let's face it, police, their responsibility should be the public safety, the primary responsibility, the public safety of peaceful, law-abiding people that are assembling, as is their right in the Constitution. And I do think the Capitol Police on the inner perimeter, they were very heroic. Once the inner perimeter breaks down in Secret Service terminology and the guns come out, the security has failed, but they were heroic in evacuating people, ensuring that congressmen and the staff were not harmed. But certainly the public safety in the last year really needs to be looked at, because people have a right to be protected as they're lawfully assembling in their constitutional rights. None of us, and I'm sure Ruben agrees, are condoning any of the illegal activity by some people out of the many that are peacefully assembling to demonstrate.
And yeah, I'm sure there's certainly a lot of security to consider as we approach inauguration in a couple of weeks. My thanks to Ruben Jonathan Miller and Matt Doherty for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, the story of a CPS teacher turned printmaker. But first, a look at the weather.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part through the generous support of the Julius Frankel Foundation.
A Chicago public school teacher took an early retirement to pursue his dream to continue in the long line of Mexican artists who excel at printmaking. From depicting calaveras, that's the skulls seen in the Day of the Dead celebration, to pursuing themes of social justice, Rene Arceo is the heir apparent to an enduring tradition. Arts producer Mark Vitale has a portrait of a Chicagoan who has recommitted himself to his art and his culture.
When we visited his studio in pre-pandemic days, he was working alone, but this artist has a talent for collaboration.
I'm Rene Arceo. I'm a printmaker. I have a collaborative place which is called Arceo Press, where I publish prints with artists from not only across the United States, but from different parts of the world. There's somebody from Costa Rica, from Puerto Rico, Canada, in Spain, and France. There's several South American artists that are living in the United States that have collaborated. Some Venezuelan, Argentinian, Peruvian.
From lino cuts and silk screens to wood engravings and etchings, printmakers need a wide range of skill sets. We first learned about Chicago's Arceo Press when the Bridgeport Art Center hosted an exhibit of work by Rene Arceo and the artists he works with. That show was called The Border Crossed Us. Arceo grew up in a small town near Guadalajara. He told us the story of his own border crossing in 1979 when, as a 19-year-old, he left Mexico and came to the U.S. His family hired a coyote to guide him, his brother, and a cousin.
I remember going through from Tijuana. There was a coyote that took a group of us in the middle of the night. It was probably around 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. We crossed the border. We saw some of the helicopters flying overhead, and down the hill we saw several groups that were being caught. We just stayed put there until, for a few hours, I don't remember how long, until there were no more helicopters flying around. And then our group leader took us, and we were walking, I don't know for how long, until sunrise practically. And then after that afternoon, they put us in the trunk of a car, a big car. I think there were 5 or 6 of us. And from there, they took us out, passed us through a checkpoint. And then from there, we went to the outskirts of Los Angeles. I feel lucky. And then I also have been able to make something of myself while coming to the States.
Arceo came to Chicago, married, and became a U.S. citizen. He studied at the School of the Art Institute and worked at what later became the National Museum of Mexican Art. And he taught at a Chicago elementary school for 20 years through the beginning of the pandemic.
We did do virtual teaching for a few months, actually. It was a lot more difficult because most of the kids were not getting connected. A lot of them didn't have, because we're talking about Humboldt Park, didn't have devices, didn't have access to the internet, so it was very difficult.
For years, he had been planning to retire to focus on his art. His work is part of the heritage of Mexican printmaking that started with the artist José Guadalupe Posada in the late 1800s, including works that feature calaveras.
And also the use of the skeletons that are doing a lot of different things, not in the bloody, spooky way like Halloween, but they are doing regular activities as if they were alive, because to us it is an extension of life, and it is what remains of this body once we die.
Arceo's artistic output is very much alive. While his early works were more political, his latest artwork concentrates on people. One is a tribute to the first responders to COVID-19 and includes a bat taking flight.
I've been able to get my artwork out there. At the same time, I continue to produce every day. I'm very happy that I'm able to do that. So essentially just getting ready until the pandemic is over so that I can do more dispersing of my work through exhibitions and collaborations with other artists as well.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
Rene Arceo recently set up an Etsy shop to sell his original works, which go for between $25 and $300. Find out more and see more of his work on our website. And that is our show for this Thursday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join Paris tomorrow night live at 7 for the Weekend Review. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe. Good evening.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, the Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm, sponsoring a free continuing legal education program for over a decade for lawyers across the state.